The silverware chimed against the porcelain plate, a delicate, mocking sound in the sudden silence. All eyes were on him, fixed there since he'd leaned back in his chair, a self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, and casually dropped the words into the easy hum of family conversation. I felt the blood drain from my face, a cold wave washing over me, leaving behind a hot, prickling shame. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken shock. My mother's hand froze mid-air, a wine glass forgotten. My father's usually jovial expression turned to stone. My sisters exchanged glances, pity and outrage warring in their eyes. He just sat there, basking in the attention he'd commanded, oblivious or perhaps gleefully aware of the devastation he'd just wrought with a single, brutal sentence. He had said it so easily, so confidently, right across the linen-draped table, under the warm glow of the chandelier, surrounded by the people who loved me most. He'd painted a picture of my future, a future without him, stripped bare and exposed, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone describing the weather. He saw my flinch, the way my smile faltered and died, and his smirk widened. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice just enough so only the immediate circle could hear, adding another layer of intimacy to the public execution. "Oh, she'll be fine," he purred, but the words were poison. "Maybe a little adjustment period. Probably living in a motel soon, until she figures things out." The fork slipped from my fingers, clattering against the plate like a gunshot. The sound seemed deafening in the stillness that followed. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. It helps me more than you know. Before that night, life had a rhythm, a predictable flow that felt like solid ground. We lived in a beautiful house he'd picked out, filled with furniture we'd chosen together, built on a foundation that felt, at the time, secure. He was charming, ambitious, driven. When we met, I was drawn to his energy, his vision. He had plans, big ones, for his business, for our future. I believed in him. I supported him. My family, bless their pragmatic hearts, were cautious but welcoming. They saw his drive, his intelligence, and they trusted my judgment. They even helped, subtly at first, then more directly, with early investments in his company. Nothing ostentatious, nothing that made him feel beholden, just quiet support to get him off the ground. I handled the home, managed our social calendar, and quietly oversaw my own financial affairs, which were comfortable, thanks to a family trust established long before I was born. It wasn't something I flaunted. It was just there. A quiet understanding of generational responsibility, managed by trustees my family had relied on for decades. He knew I came from a well-off family, of course. He knew about the trust in a general sense, the way someone knows about distant relatives they've never met. He understood it provided a certain level of security, but I don't think he ever grasped its true nature, its scope, or the intricate legal framework that governed it. He saw it as a static pool of money, something for the women in the family to inherit eventually, not a dynamic entity with its own rules and mechanisms, managed by fiercely protective fiduciaries. He saw me as a lovely wife, a social asset, connected to wealth but not, in his mind, a significant financial player herself. He was the one building the empire, the one making the real money, the one with the business acumen. He was the engine, I was, well, the comfortable passenger as he likely saw it. Our life was a tapestry woven with threads of shared dreams, comfortable routines, and an undercurrent of his growing confidence, which sometimes spilled into arrogance. He worked late, traveled often, and talked incessantly about growth, market share, acquisitions. I listened, I encouraged, I celebrated his successes. I thought we were a team, navigating the world together. I thought we were building our future. The thought that he might ever see me as disposable, as someone who could end up living in a motel soon, was not just alien, it was absurd. Until that night. The words hung in the air, staining the warmth of the room. It wasn't just the prediction of hardship, it was the casual dismissal, the public humiliation. He was telling my family, his audience, that should our marriage fail, I would be destitute, a cautionary tale. He was implying my entire worth, my security, was dependent on him, on his success, and without it, I was nothing. The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. My family knew intimately about the trust. They knew its provisions, its intent, its strength. They had ensured I was not only a beneficiary but had a voice in certain matters, particularly concerning its protection and the well-being of its beneficiaries. What he said was a direct insult, not just to me, but to them, to the very fabric of our family's legacy and foresight. But in that moment, all I felt was the searing pain of his betrayal. The man I loved, the man I'd built a life with, had just publicly stripped me bare and mocked my vulnerability, a vulnerability he himself was creating by shattering the marriage. The silence stretched, agonizing. My father cleared his throat, a low, dangerous sound. My mother's hand tightened on the stem of her glass. My sister's eyes were fixed on me, full of a fierce, protective love. I had a choice: collapse or stand. I chose to breathe. I forced a small, tight smile. "That's an interesting projection, darling," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, though it had a brittle edge. Though perhaps a touch dramatic, he chuckled, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "Just being realistic, love. The world out there is tough when you're not supported." The implication hung heavy. Supported by him. Supported by his success. The rest of the dinner was a blur of forced cheerfulness and strained conversation. The food tasted like ash. Every polite question felt like an interrogation. Every glance felt like scrutiny. He remained infuriatingly jovial, as if he'd just told a harmless joke. He didn't see the cracks forming, the irreparable damage he'd inflicted. He only saw the stage he'd claimed and the audience he believed he'd swayed. The drive home was silent. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the car, punctuated only by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I stared out the window, watching the city lights blur, each one a distant, indifferent star in a cold universe. The words replayed in my mind, a relentless loop of degradation. Living in a motel soon, it wasn't just a cruel joke. It felt like a statement of intent. A declaration that he believed he held all the cards, that my future was entirely dependent on his whims, and that he was prepared to watch me fall. Back at the house, the silence persisted. We moved through our routines like strangers in a shared space. I went through the motions of getting ready for bed, the air thick with unspoken accusations and the residue of his public cruelty. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, to ask how he could possibly say something so vicious, so untrue, so publicly damaging. But the words wouldn't come. They were choked by the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. He didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain it away as a bad joke. He acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened. That indifference was worse than the cruelty. It showed me he meant it. Or, at the very least, that he believed it was a plausible outcome, one he was comfortable envisioning. My first attempts to process this were clumsy, internal. I felt a wave of panic, a primal fear. What if he could somehow orchestrate that? What if the life I thought was solid was built on sand? I knew, intellectually, about the trust, about my own resources, but his confidence had a terrifying power. He had so clearly believed in his own prediction, in his own ability to leave me vulnerable. It made me question my own security, my own understanding of our shared finances, our shared life. The house, the cars, the accounts, how intertwined were they? How much leverage did he actually have? I spent the next few days in a fog. The house felt different, colder. His presence felt like a threat. He continued to act normally, perhaps even a little more jovial, as if the dinner had been a triumph. He talked about business, about deals, about money, always money. His focus was laser-sharp on his empire, his growing wealth, his power. He seemed utterly disconnected from the emotional wreckage he'd created. I tried to talk to him, gently at first. I asked him about the comment, how he could say that. He brushed it off. Just a joke, lighten up, but there was no warmth in his eyes, no genuine attempt at reassurance. Just a dismissive wave of his hand. It wasn't a joke. It was a threat thinly veiled as a prediction. It was the moment I realized the man I married was gone, replaced by a stranger who saw me as an accessory he was planning to discard. The tension in the house became a physical thing, a weight pressing down on me. Every conversation felt like navigating a minefield. He started making more pointed remarks about money, about my spending, about my perceived lack of contribution to the household finances. A cruel twist, considering the early support my family had provided, support he'd conveniently forgotten or chosen to ignore. He'd say things like, "Are you sure we need that? We have to be careful with expenses now," despite his business supposedly thriving. Or, "It's easy to spend other people's money, isn't it?" Followed by a knowing look. It was a constant drip of erosion, designed to make me feel guilty, dependent, and financially illiterate. Meanwhile, his business dealings seemed to grow more complex, more opaque. He was always on the phone, always in meetings, speaking in hushed tones about leveraged buyouts, aggressive expansions, and securing new lines of credit. He exuded an air of frantic energy, disguised as unstoppable momentum. He'd come home late, exhausted but buzzing, full of self-importance. He'd talk at me, rattling off figures and jargon, not seeking my input, but performing for me, demonstrating his dominance in the financial arena he clearly believed was solely his. I started paying closer attention, not just to his words, but to the documents that lay around, the casual mentions of names and companies. I'd spent years being a supportive wife, trusting his judgment implicitly when it came to his business. Now, suspicion gnawed at me. Was his business as solid as he claimed? Was his need to portray me as financially precarious a reflection of his own hidden instability? I began, quietly, discreetly, to educate myself. I pulled up old articles about his company, looked into the names he mentioned, tried to piece together the puzzle of his financial world. It was like looking through a smudged window. I could see shapes, but the details were blurry. He was a master of presentation, of making things look successful. But beneath the polished surface, I sensed a frantic scrambling, a house of cards being built at dizzying speed. My own financial situation, managed by the trust, felt like a separate universe. I had quarterly reports, meetings with the trustees, a clear understanding of my assets, conservatively managed but substantial. It was a world of quiet stability, utterly alien to the volatile, high-stakes game he seemed to be playing. He never asked about it in detail, never showed interest beyond a general understanding that I was set. He was too focused on his empire, his money, his power. He saw my family's wealth as background radiation, not a force with its own structure and rules. This became clearer the more I dug. He had taken out significant loans, leveraged existing assets, all tied to the perceived stability and future potential of his company. He was expanding rapidly, maybe too rapidly. And some of those early infusions of capital from my family? They weren't simple gifts. They had been structured legally, through entities tied to the trust, with specific terms, conditions, and, crucially, protective clauses for the beneficiaries and the trust itself. At the time, it had seemed like sensible business practice, ensuring accountability. Now, it looked like a potential lifeline for me and a hidden vulnerability for him. The emotional distance between us became an unbridgeable chasm. He was a stranger in my home, a hostile presence. He continued his campaign of subtle financial psychological warfare. He'd leave bills lying around, sigh dramatically about expenses, or make pointed comments about divorce settlements he'd read about, always highlighting how little the wife got. It felt like he was preparing the ground, softening me up for a future fight he intended to win by portraying me as financially incompetent and dependent. One evening, I overheard him on the phone in his study, the door slightly ajar. His voice was tight with stress, a different tone from the booming confidence he usually projected. He was arguing with someone, probably a lender. Phrases like extend the terms, liquidity issues, and market volatility drifted into the hall. When he hung up, he let out a frustrated roar and slammed his fist on the desk. He emerged a few minutes later, putting on his usual cheerful facade, but the mask was cracking. He poured himself a stiff drink, his hands trembling slightly. "Tough day?" I asked cautiously. He glared at me. "Just business. Nothing you'd understand. He resented any perceived intrusion into his world, especially by me. It solidified my suspicion. His position wasn't as strong as he pretended, and his need to diminish my own financial standing was likely a projection of his own insecurity. He needed me to believe I was nothing without him, because perhaps he was nothing without the illusion of success. This realization was the midpoint shift. The hurt began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He wasn't just being cruel, he was being strategic. He was trying to dismantle me, to isolate me, to prepare for a future where he came out on top, keeping everything he'd built, including, likely, assets accumulated during the marriage, while leaving me with nothing, just as he'd predicted. The idea of the motel wasn't just a throwaway line, it was a vision he was actively trying to make plausible. I stopped feeling like a victim and started feeling like an opponent. A dangerous one, because he had fundamentally underestimated my position. He saw my family's wealth as a distant background, not a protective force field I was intricately connected to. He saw the trust as an inheritance, not an active entity with its own governance and interests that included ensuring the security of its beneficiaries. My pity for him evaporated, replaced by a chilling determination. I wouldn't just survive, I would reclaim my dignity and my future. And I would use every resource available to me, resources he was utterly blind to or chose to ignore. The situation escalated rapidly. His behavior became erratic. The mask of control slipped more often. He was clearly under immense pressure, though he still refused to admit it to me. He started making thinly veiled threats about divorce again, but with more aggression. Maybe we should just cut our losses, he'd sneer. Starting fresh might be best for both of us. You could, simplify things. Simplify things meant stripping me of everything, leaving me to fend for myself. He seemed determined to push me out, to force my hand, clearly believing I had no leverage, no options outside of whatever meager settlement he might deign to offer. He even suggested we consolidate some assets, his business holdings and our joint property. For streamlining purposes, it was a transparent attempt to entangle my more stable assets with his increasingly precarious business empire, likely to shield them from his own potential downfall or to make any future separation messier and more advantageous for him. I politely but firmly refused, citing advice I'd received years ago about keeping personal and business finances strictly separate, advice that, ironically, had come from the trust's advisors. He scoffed, calling me old-fashioned, but the refusal clearly frustrated him. The house felt like a cage. I felt trapped, the air thick with his aggression and my own rising fear, quickly turning into icy resolve. He seemed to gain confidence from my apparent isolation within the marriage, mistaking my silence for weakness. He didn't know I was using that silence to gather information, to strategize, to quietly build my case. I started consulting with the trust's legal team more frequently. They were discreet, professional, and knew my family's affairs and the history of their support for his business, inside and out. They explained the nuances of the early investments, the carefully worded agreements, the protective clauses designed precisely for situations like this. Situations where a beneficiary's security might be threatened by external financial entanglements or marital dissolution. They confirmed my suspicions about the precariousness of his current position. He was overextended, his rapid expansion fueled by dangerous levels of debt, his confidence a facade hiding panic. The trust, it turned out, held significant leverage he was completely unaware of. Not just as an early investor, but through complex, legally binding agreements that intertwined with his business structure in ways he likely never bothered to understand, or perhaps had forgotten over the years of focusing solely on his own perceived brilliance. He thought he was playing chess. He didn't realize I was playing a different game entirely, on a board he didn't even know existed, governed by rules he didn't comprehend. My world felt like it was crumbling, but in the rubble, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed. I was no longer reacting, I was planning. I was no longer just the wife he mocked. I was a beneficiary of a powerful, protective entity, and I was ready to authorize that entity to act. The turning point wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was a quiet meeting in a hushed office downtown. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Across the polished table sat Mr. Abernathy, the lead trustee, a man who had known my family for generations, his face a roadmap of quiet wisdom and unwavering integrity. Beside him was Ms. Chen, a sharp, meticulous lawyer from the firm that managed the trust's legal affairs. I laid out everything: his dinner comment, the escalating financial pressure, the overheard phone calls, his attempts to entangle our assets, his barely concealed contempt, my fear for my future security. I showed them the scattered notes I'd taken, the public records I'd found about his business liabilities. They listened with grave, attentive silence. When I finished, Mr. Abernathy leaned forward. "He is clearly attempting to undermine your security and potentially expose trust-related assets to undue risk through his own precarious ventures," he stated, his voice calm but firm. Ms. Chen nodded. The agreements surrounding the initial investments were drafted with precisely this kind of scenario in mind, though, frankly, we never anticipated such public displays of malice. There are clauses that trigger under conditions of financial instability, attempts to defraud beneficiaries, or actions deemed detrimental to the trust's interests or the security of its capital. His recent actions, combined with the apparent state of his business, trigger several of these provisions. They explained the mechanism. The trust held specific, legally binding instruments related to those early investments, not just passive shares, but structured finance agreements, perhaps convertible notes, or even senior debt, tied to specific assets within his company. These instruments had covenants he was now likely violating due to his overall financial distress and leveraging. The trust had the legal right to call in these obligations immediately, and if he couldn't pay, it allowed the trust to take control of the underlying assets. Those assets, it turned out, included key operational parts of his business, perhaps even the building his main office was in, depending on how he had structured his borrowing and what collateral was involved. It wasn't just a debt collection. It was a legal pathway to taking control of a significant portion of his business, rendering it inoperable or severely diminished. They needed my authorization to initiate the process. It would be swift, clinical, and entirely within their legal rights. It would, effectively, dismantle his empire, the one he was so sure was the source of all power, his and mine by extension. The silence in the room after they explained the full implications was profound. This wasn't just about getting back at him. It was about protecting myself, securing my future, and upholding the integrity of the trust that was my birthright, responsibility I now fully embraced. It was a sober decision, heavy with the weight of finality. The man I married had tried to burn my world down. Now I had the means to watch his world crumble, legally and irrevocably. I looked at Mr. Abernathy and Miss Chen, their faces steady and waiting. I took a deep breath, the air cool in my lungs. "Do it," I said. The words were soft, but they resonated with the force of absolute conviction. The day it happened was a Tuesday. Gray skies hung heavy over the city, mirroring the somber mood I carried within me. I wasn't there to witness it directly, though I had been given the option. Mr. Abernathy and Ms. Chen advised against it, saying it would be handled professionally, impersonally, as a strictly legal and financial matter. But I had my own way of being present. I sat in a quiet cafe a few blocks from his main office building, sipping coffee that had gone cold. I watched the pedestrians, the cars, the ordinary flow of city life, a stark contrast to the seismic shift occurring just around the corner. I knew the time. The legal team had given me a narrow window. And then my phone rang. It was Ms. Chen. Her voice was calm, professional. "It is done," she stated simply. "The notices have been served. The assets are secured. The operational control has been transferred to trust-appointed management." He was informed. There was a brief pause, and I could almost hear the unsaid details lingering in the air. "Informed?" I prompted, needing to hear something, anything. "Yes," she said, a dry note entering her voice. "He is reacting. The legal equivalent of screaming, I presumed. He would have been blindsided. He had built his fortress of perceived invincibility, his empire of debt and arrogance, utterly convinced he was untouchable by my side of the family, that their support had been passive, easily dismissed largesse. He had banked on my supposed helplessness, on the idea that my wealth was distant, abstract, something that would eventually trickle down to me, but offered no immediate power or protection that he needed to fear. He had publicly predicted my financial ruin, scoffed at my security, and planned his exit strategy based on my perceived vulnerability. And now, the very entity he'd dismissed, the trust he'd misunderstood, the legal framework he'd ignored, was dismantling his life's work piece by piece, using the leverage he'd unwittingly given them years ago and the authority I had granted just days before. He had been so focused on his game, his power, his control, he never saw the quiet, ancient force moving beneath the surface, connected directly to the woman he had belittled. His screams, wherever they were happening, weren't just about losing the business. They were about the crushing realization that the little woman he'd planned to leave in a motel had, through her deep, quiet roots in her family's legacy, authorized the legal equivalent of an earthquake that swallowed his entire world. He hadn't just mocked me. He had mocked the very foundation of my family's strength, and that foundation had risen up and swallowed him whole. He expected me to be a victim. He never imagined I could be the hand that pulled the lever. He thought he was the predator, and I the prey. He was wrong. I was the landscape, and he had built his fragile house on a fault line. The silence on the phone stretched, filled with the static of finality. "Thank you, Miss Chen," I finally said, my voice barely a whisper. "I appreciate your efficiency. Such a sterile word for the complete appending of a life, the destruction of an empire built on lies and arrogance." I hung up and just sat there, the cold coffee in my hand, watching the city pass by. There was no triumphant surge, no wave of exhilarating victory. Just emptiness. A vast, quiet emptiness where my marriage used to be, where my perceived future used to be, where the noise of his ambition and cruelty had once filled every corner. The screams I imagined were not satisfying. They were the dying cries of something I had once loved, or thought I had loved, revealing its monstrous true form in its final moments. The plot twist wasn't just that he lost his business, it was how he lost it and who orchestrated it. It wasn't random karma. It was a deliberate, authorized act triggered by his own actions, facilitated by a system he never bothered to understand, and set in motion by the woman he thought he could break. He had underestimated the quiet power of legacy, the strength of roots that ran deeper than his shallow ambition. He had seen my connection to my family as a passive inheritance, a safety net I'd cling to after he discarded me. He never saw it as an active, protective force capable of defending its own. He had laughed about me being in a motel. Now his world was the one being repossessed, brick by brick, asset by asset, by the very family force he had so casually disrespected. His screaming was the sound of that force crushing him, not with brute strength, but with the quiet, relentless pressure of legal clauses and authorized actions. He had built his life on borrowed money and assumed superiority. I had quietly stood on ground that had been solid for generations. When the storm came, his structure collapsed. Mine stood firm and even had the power to clear the debris. In the days and weeks that followed, the quiet professionalism of the trust's aftermath was a stark contrast to the drama of the preceding months. The repossession was handled with swift, legal precision. His business was restructured, assets sold off or absorbed, debts managed by the trust's appointed administrators. The details were complex, impersonal, reported to me in dry, factual summaries. The man himself, he faded from prominence. The screams, I imagined, subsided into a shocked, broken silence. He was left with very little, certainly not the empire he had envisioned. His prediction of my motel stay became a dark, ironic echo against the reality of his own dispossession. My home, my security, my future, they were protected, entirely independent of him. The trust, this quiet, powerful entity I was intrinsically linked to, had shielded me, just as it was designed to do. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with a profound sadness. I had won, yes. I had turned the tables in a way he could never have conceived. I had used the strength he had mocked to dismantle his world when he tried to dismantle mine. But it came at the cost of a marriage, a shared history, and the painful revelation of the man I had married. He wasn't just flawed, he was fundamentally cruel and arrogant, blinded by his own perceived brilliance. The scars remained, unseen but deeply felt. The memory of that dinner, the coldness in his eyes, the casual brutality of his words, they were etched into my mind. I had survived. I had proven him wrong in the most definitive way possible. I had walked through fire and emerged, not unscathed, but unbroken, standing on the solid ground of my own history and strength. The future stretched before me, quiet and open. It wasn't the future I had planned, but it was mine, built not on the shifting sands of someone else's ambition, but on the bedrock of my own resilience and the quiet power of holding true to who you are, even when someone tries to tell you that you are nothing. The motel prediction was his vision of my worth. My reality was quiet security, reclaimed dignity, and the profound knowledge that the greatest strength often lies not in the noise you make, but in the deep, silent roots you possess, and the willingness to let them hold you firm when the world tries to blow you away. If this story hit close to home, I'd love to hear your version. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is. Thanks for being here. Subscribing helps bring more of these to life.